Alright, so here's the second video for Unit 6. So this is Unit 6 still. We're talking about signed numbers. In other words, positive and negative numbers. What we're going to do is subtract signed numbers. And basically the rule is you can't subtract. So the procedure for subtracting signed numbers is on page 191. It says, change the sign of the number being subtracted, which is the second number. So if I have 5 minus negative 7, I change the sign of the number being subtracted. That's a negative 7, so I change it to positive 7. And it says add the resulting sign number, so the minus becomes plus. I always say the procedure for subtracting signed numbers is to add the opposite. Add the opposite. So that means that you're taking the number after, you're taking the subtraction sign, you're changing it to addition, and the number after the subtraction sign becomes its opposite sign. So if it's negative, it becomes positive. If it's positive, it becomes negative. So if we just look at some examples, let's say I want to take negative 40 minus negative 40. Okay, what I'll do is I always leave the first one. I change that to a plus, and that changes signs. That's a negative 40, so it becomes 40. So negative 40 plus 40. Now I need to follow the rules for different signs, okay? Adding numbers with different signs. I subtract the numbers, so 40 minus 40 equals 0. Well, that's just 0. So, because they're both the same sign. All right, let's take a look at another one. Let's say I have 2.7 minus 5.6. Okay, to take 2.7 minus 5.6, I'm going to say 2.7 plus. Okay, that minus is what changed to a plus. So now my number is 5.6. It becomes the opposite sign, negative 5.6. Now I follow the rules for adding, which says I subtract these. So 5.6 minus 2.7. I get 2.9. Then I take the absolute value of these, and whichever one's greater, well, this is the bigger number, 5.6. It's negative, so my answer is negative 2.9. All right, so now we move to multiplying and dividing. So when we multiply two or more signed numbers, this is on page 192, it says we multiply the absolute values of the numbers. So we just multiply the numbers. Absolute values, we just make them all positive and multiply them. If all the numbers are positive, the product is positive. That should be obvious. You've been multiplying positive numbers your whole life so far. So if they're all positive, the answer is positive. Count the number of negative signs. If there's an odd number of negative signs, then the answer is negative. If there's an even number of negative signs, the product is positive. So in other words, in the problem, if there's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 negatives, the answer is negative. One negative and one positive will make it a negative. So if we just take a look down at some problems. So let's just say I have negative 3 times negative 1 times negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 2 times negative 1. I'm just going to multiply. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 3 is 18. 18 times 2 is 36. 36 times 1 is 36. I just multiplied the numbers. You could get your calculator out and do that. That's fine. Now I count the negatives. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives. That's an even number, so that makes this a positive 36. Okay, so now I have negative 3 times positive 1 times negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 2 times negative 1. Okay, notice it's the same number, so they're going to multiply to be 36. But this time when I count the negatives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are 5 negatives, so that makes the answer negative 36. Okay, so let's just say I wanted to multiply 1 1/2 times negative 1/2. All right, so, well, I multiply the numbers. So to multiply 1 1/2, I change it to 3 halves times 1/2. I multiply straight across the top, straight across the bottom, and get 3/4. And then since there's one negative, that's odd, the answer is negative 3/4. All right, so dividing. Okay, dividing signed numbers. Divide the absolute values of the numbers. Determine the sign of the quotient. Okay, well, the sign of the quotient is, if there's one negative, the answer is negative. They've got it right up here. This is all in your book, page 194. I'm using this so you can see that the instructions are right in your book. So if both numbers have the same sign, both negative or both positive, the quotient, the answer to the division, is positive. So two negatives or both two positives make a positive. If the two numbers have unlike signs, one positive, one negative, the answer is negative. All right, so let's say I'm going to divide negative 15 divided by 1 1/4. Okay, so I'm going to divide 15 over 1 divided by 5/4. To divide, remember you multiply by the reciprocal. And I can cancel that. 5 becomes a 1, that becomes a 3. I multiply straight across and I get 12 over 1, but I don't write 12 over 1, I just write 12. Now, there was one negative in the problem, so that means the answer is negative 12. All right, so now we need to look at powers of signed numbers. So when we're dealing with powers of signed numbers, apply the procedure from multiplying signed numbers to raising signed numbers to powers. So it's the same as multiplying. So if there's an even number of negatives, the answer is positive. Even number of negatives equals positive answer. If there is an odd number of negative signs, the answer is negative. So a power, basically, if we talk about a power, if I have 2 to the 4th, just in general, this is called the base, and this is called the power or the exponent. Okay? So you always take the base. The base is the number you multiply, what you multiply. And then this is how many times. So you're taking 2 and writing it 4 times, and you're multiplying them all together. So this is the same as 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 16. Okay, so if I have negative 2 to the 4th power, that is negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Well, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is still 16, but 4 negatives, 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives makes it a positive 16. So if I had negative 2 to the 3rd power, that would be negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, which is 8. But since there are 3 negatives, 1, 2, 3, that's an odd number of negatives. The answer is negative 8. So as far as using, multiplying and dividing, you can use your calculator for that. Your calculator even has a negative sign. This symbol, this button on your calculator, it should look like that, or it might say plus minus like this. That will change the signs of the numbers, and you can use that on your calculator. And they actually walk you through, if you look on page 196, most of them, it just says, okay, if you want to take negative 3.874 to the 5th power, and this is for the TI-30 that I recommended that you get, you're going to type in that number, and then this button changes it to the plus minus, and then you're going to hit this button, the y, x to the y power, and then the 5th power. Now some calculators, you can take, it just depends on your calculator. So some calculators you're going to have to take parentheses, and then your negative or your negative sign. Type in the 3.874 in the parentheses, then hit your x to the y or the caret button, and then the 5th power and enter. So most of the time you're going to be you have to put the negative number in parentheses in order to get it to give you the right sign on your calculator. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is negative exponents. So negative exponents. So a negative exponent, it's a negative power, okay? That would be something like x to the negative n. And that's really kind of confusing because we're using variables. So let's just say I have 5 to the negative 2. 5 to the negative 2 power, okay? A negative power, to make it a positive, you put it on the bottom of a fraction. So if we always think we've got a top and a bottom, okay? And if there's no bottom written, this is assumed to be on the top. So this is on the top. So if I want to make this a positive 2 power, all I do is I move the 5 to the bottom, and the negative 2 power moved to the bottom becomes a positive 2 power, and then I have a 1 on top. Okay, so let's, if you had it on the bottom, if you had 1 over 5 to the negative 2, then you move it to the top. To change a negative power to a positive, you move it to the part of the fraction that it's not. So to make this positive, I would move the 5 to the 2 to the top, and it becomes positive. And then I don't write over 1, okay, you just write 5 squared. So let's say I wanted to work out something, like you were given something like negative 2 to the negative 3 power, and you wanted to find out what number is that. Well, the first thing you do is you have to make that negative power positive. So you're going to put it on the bottom. That negative 2 doesn't change because it's not in a power. So this, if I put it on the bottom, it becomes negative 2 to the 3rd power. So now I still have a 1 on top, and now I have negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 on the bottom. And 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, so still 1 on the top, 8 on the bottom. A negative, 3 negatives makes the whole answer negative. And you just put the negative on the top or out in front of the whole thing. All right, now we have roots. Okay, so roots of sign numbers, if we're dealing with roots of sign numbers, this right here, if you've got a root, something like this, like the cube root of 8, this is the root that you're taking, and it's called the index. And this is called the radicand. It's the number you're taking the root of, and this is the radical sign. Okay, so this is the root. So whatever number's in this little thing right here, that's the root. So this is the cube root of 8. Cube root of 8. Okay, you could take the cube root of negative 8, and that would be fine. Now what this is asking is what number times itself 3 times, cube root, what number times itself 3 times is equal to 8? That's what this is asking. What number times itself, whatever that is, 3 times is equal to 8? Well, that's 2 times 2 times 2, so the root is 2. The answer is 2. This one, same thing. What number times itself 3 times is negative 8? Well, that's negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. So they've got a nice little chart here that if the root, okay, this is the root, the index is the root. If the root is even and the radicand, the number under the radical, is positive, then the answer is positive. If it's an even root and a negative number, there's no solution. You can't take the square root of a negative number. If you had the square root, this is the square root, by the way. It means there's a 2 there, but really there's not. We don't write it. So this is the square root. Square root, it means what times itself. Okay, so like 16. So the square root of 16, it means what times itself, what number times itself is 16? That's 4 times 4, so the answer is 4. But if you're trying to take the square root of negative 16, negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. And you can't just have one negative because then it's not a number times itself. So you cannot take the square root or even roots of negative numbers. Okay, and then it just tells you if it's an odd root of a negative number, the answer is negative. An odd root of a positive number, it's positive. So that should run you through all of the rules. The very last thing is a review of the order of operations, but then with signed numbers, but it's the same thing. You're going to do all parentheses first, and then you're going to do powers, and then you're going to do multiply and divide from left to right, and then you're going to do add and subtract from left to right. All right, that should be all of the videos. You've got your homework, and you should be able to roll. Thank you.